We now finally reach 2 Samuel 9 and see how David is a demonstration of Christ as a friend to Jonathan. And in understanding what's going on here, you got to see where David, at this point in the story, flash forward to 2 Samuel 9. David is at the highest point of his reign as king over Israel. He's sort of basically, the 2015-2016 Golden State Warriors, the 95-96 Bulls, and the 2018 Clemson football team all wrapped into one person. He's winning every war, so much to the point that in chapter 8, verse 14, it says that the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went. I mean, who wouldn't want that kind of endorsement? And it might seem like at that time that David could have forgotten about Jonathan easily. I mean, after all, David grieved over Jonathan's death in 2 Samuel chapter 1. He put Jonathan and Saul's name in all the history books, and he could have easily forgotten about that and let Jonathan's name continue to remain in shame. But remember, David represents Christ to Jonathan, and how does he do that? He does that through restoration and fellowship to Jonathan. You see, when Jonathan and Saul were killed, Jonathan left behind a son who was 5 years old. And as news got out that the line of Saul was no more, a nurse that was taking care of Jonathan's son ran away. But unfortunately, that nurse was careless. And Jonathan's son, as a result of that, became lame and crippled. Jonathan's son's name was Mephibosheth. And for the rest of his life, he would grow up carrying the generations of shame of Jonathan and Saul. You can imagine growing up like this in a culture and a time where any physical disability was perceived to be the judgment of God. Imagine people passing him by, looking at him at first glance, and whether it was said out loud or said in their minds, thinking to themselves, would you look at Mephibosheth, son of the disgraced Jonathan? God crippled him because him and his family are nothing now. The line of Saul will die. Imagine trying to raise a family with that kind of disgraced reputation. So what do you do when you try and live life despite the shame of everything around you? Well, you move. Jonathan's son Mephibosheth leaves the city of Gibeah, where Jonathan was supposed to rule and reign. And in chapter 9, we read here, David finds him in a city called Lo-Debar. Now, Lo-Debar, translated, literally means the land of nothing. So here we have Jonathan's son, Mephibosheth, living in a land of nothing, crippled, disgraced, and carrying the shame of his family. Now, what would you believe about yourself in this moment? What kind of things would you tell yourself if you were in his shoes? What would terrify you in meeting David, this man that the Lord gave every victory to, and realize that your grandfather tried to kill David at every turn? What would you think about David, who was supposed to keep the covenant and yet, up until this point in your life, seems completely absent? Well, you would probably respond in the way that Mephibosheth does in verses 6 to 8 of 2 Samuel 9. Mephibosheth refers himself as a servant or a slave and as a dead dog. Both of those terms are not meant to be humble terms. They were meant to describe how he truly felt about the shame and disgrace that followed him. He believed himself not as someone as made in the image of God, but someone who was cursed by God, irredeemable. He believed the actions of his family left his line, his circumstances, beyond redemption. There was no way that anyone could love him. Anyone could be a friend to him. Who wants to be a friend, after all, with a cripple from the land of nothing? But David here displays the full, generous, overwhelming love of covenant friendship in verse 7. He brings restoration. Restoration of Mephibosheth's kingdom by returning all the land that once belonged to Jonathan and Saul. Restoration of fellowship into the king's court. Restoration of the servants' households of Saul. And restoration of their land and their property here in these verses. You see, restoration for David meant not just a relationship restoration, but a restoration of all that the kingdom had lost in the wake of carrying the shame of Jonathan's name. He doesn't just say, things are all good, Mephibosheth, go in peace and be warmed and be filled. Instead, he lives out being community in covenant and brings about a restoration of Mephibosheth's family and extended kingdom. This had no military value. This was surely costly to the kingdom. This came at a price of other priorities of the kingdom of Israel's budget draft, I'm sure. But remember, the covenant isn't about convenience. It's about restoration. So David does restoration to Mephibosheth and opens the doors for Jonathan's name to be made whole again. But he not only does that, you see, if you look at the very end of the story, 2 Samuel 9, verse 13, you'll notice an amazing detail. Mephibosheth always ate at the king's table. David would bring in this crippled, lame son of a shamed king into his most intimate place, the dining table, to fellowship with him always. You see, for David, it was about remembering the covenant is eternal and lasting. It was outrageous hospitality to someone who didn't deserve it at all, at least in the world's eyes. And suddenly, this new stranger into David's life becomes one of the closest people that David would know and has fellowship at his table. Rosario Butterfield, in her must-read book about hospitality called The Gospel Comes with a House Key, speaks on what true Christian restoration and fellowship is about. And she compares this against what we would call false fellowship. She calls it counterfeit hospitality. She says, quote, "Counterfeit hospitality comes with strings. Christian hospitality comes with strangers becoming neighbors, becoming family of God, and fathering in the great expectation of God's coming world. Imagine a world where no one languishes in crushing loneliness, where no abused woman or man or child suffers alone, where people take their real and pressing problems to Christians who have the reputation of being helpers, and where victims are not swept away, lost, forgotten. It values the time it takes to invest in relationships, to build bridges, to repent of sins of the past, and to reconcile." End quote. This is the power of the beauty of covenant friendships. If only we had the faith to pursue it. I believe that Jonathan, by the way, always knew that David would remember the covenant. And now, why do I believe this? You see, Mephibosheth is admittedly a strange name to give to your child, unless you know what Mephibosheth means. The name Mephibosheth, and perhaps the greatest sign of Jonathan's faith in the covenant friendship, translates in English, Mephibosheth is the one who will remove my shame. So let's recap. David is a friend of Jonathan, right? The king invites a disgraced stranger, invites him to his table. This dead dog, this slave, less than human, crippled to the table. And he invites this person to have fellowship with the king, to live in the kingdom, once outside the kingdom, brings him into his courts, and now it is fellowship at his table forever. Who is David reminding you of right now? See, Redeemer, this is the love of Christ on display for us. The one to remove our shame. Jesus, our great King, invites us to fellowship and friendship with him forever. If we could approach him in faith and trust in the promises of his covenant with us. This is the free invitation of the gospel being offered to you today. So as we close, can you think about these questions? Can you think about a time where restoring a relationship was difficult but worth it? And what would true Christian fellowship require of us? How does the generosity of God as King remind us all of our duties as Christians here today? I want you to think about those questions and come back as we end with the benediction.